get started, shall we? Attend, O reader, our tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Where last week we finished off one of our author permission books, Wheelers by Matt Stevens, which I found an absolutely delightful solar punk tale, um, that I feel is a really good entry into the genre. If you need like an on ramp, that I would say would work very very well. This time we are going to dive back into the public domain, familiar territory, as you may know if you're a regular listener, and we're going to this time start reading Edison's Conquest of Mars by Garrett P. Serviss. This is an entry into an early science fiction genre called an Edisonade, um, where essentially, it's a person gifted in the sciences, usually, uh, finding themselves, whether intentionally or unintentionally, conquesting a land that is foreign to them. And as much as that does make these types of books a particular source of uh, the disclaimer, the reminders that the disclaimer around here exists, uh, there's also there's also a lot of really fun concepts in here, a lot of fun vintage science fiction stuff. Um, this book in particular is actually kind of a standout in that it stars Edison himself, rather than just some protagonist. Um, at large, the probably the most popular Edisonade outside of this would be the Tom Swift series. Tom Swift, who you may know from his electric rifle. That's right. That's why it's called the Taser. It's called Thomas A. Swift's electric rifle, Taser. And it's named after this random pulp character that I knew nothing about until I learned that. and because my pulp of choice as a young person was a series of detective novels you might know the name of, the Hardy Boys, which a fun additional fun fact though, two or three of those are in the United States public domain, and we will get to them eventually. But for now, let's retain our focus on Edison's conquest of Mars and see just what Mr. Serviss here has written in regards to this then beloved inventor's conquest of the Red Planet, shall we? Chapter 1. It is impossible that the stupendous events which followed the disastrous invasion of Earth by the Martians should go without record, and circumstances having placed the facts at my disposal, I deem it a duty, both to posterity and to those who were witnesses of and participants in the avenging counterstroke that the Earth dealt back at its ruthless enemy in the heavens, to write down the story in a connected form. Oh, 5 Hardy Boys are out now. That's actually really good news. That might bump them up the schedule for me. Gariki, thank you for that correction there. That's very exciting. I am a huge fan of the Hardy Boys. I think they are most likely the source of my ardent love for pulp novels. Well, that and Animorphs and Goosebumps, but Animorphs and Goosebumps are uh, unlikely to become public domain in my lifetime. So, Hardy Boys are a bit more relevant. Um, but that's actually really interesting. I should see which ones those are and see if any of them are the ones I remember very clearly. Uh, One of the big hits that I think most who have read the Hardy Boys would remember would be well, the one with the grandfather clock. It's also I've very very evidently read later printings of the books because like it specifically calls out them using like dirt bikes and like all-terrain vehicles and stuff, so they're very much like modernized printings. But I digress. The Martians had nearly all perished, not through our puny efforts, but in consequence of disease, and the few survivors fled in one of their projectile cars, inflicting their cruelest blow in the act of departure. That being their mysterious explosive. They possessed a mysterious explosive of unimaginable puissance, with whose aid they set the car in motion for Mars from a point in Bergen County, New Jersey, just the back of the Palisades. Palisades. The force of the explosion may be imagined when it is recollected that they had to give the car a velocity of more than 7 miles per second in order to overcome the attraction of the Earth and the resistance of the atmosphere. The shock destroyed all of New York that had not already fallen a prey, and all the buildings yet standing in the surrounding towns and cities fell in one far-circling ruin. The Palisades tumbled in vast sheets, starting a tidal wave in the Hudson that drowned the opposite shore, leaving thousands of victims. The victims of this ferocious explosion were numbered by the tens of thousands, and the shock, transmitted through the rocky frame of the globe, was recorded by seismographic pendulums in England and on the continent of Europe. The terrible results achieved by the invaders had produced everywhere a mingled feeling of consternation and hopelessness. The devastation was widespread. The death-dealing engines with which the Martians had brought them had proved irresistible, and the inhabitants of the earth possessed nothing capable of contending against them. There had been no protection for the great cities, no protection even for the open country. Everything had gone down before the savage onslaught of those merciless invaders from space. Savage ruins covered the sites of many formerly flourishing towns and villages, and the broken walls of great cities stared at the heavens like the exhumed skeletons of Pompeii. The awful agencies had extirpated pastures and meadows and dried up the very springs of fertility in the earth where they'd touched it. In some parts of the devastated lands, pestilence broke out. Elsewhere there was famine. Despondency black as night brooded over some of the fairest portions of the globe. Yet not all had been destroyed, because all had not been reached by the withering hand of the destroyer. The Martians had not had time to complete their work before they themselves fell a prey to the diseases that carried them off at the very culmination of their triumph. From those lands which had fortunately escaped invasion, relief was sent to the sufferers. The outburst of pity and charity exceeded anything the world had known. Differences of race and religion were swallowed up in the universal sympathy which was felt for those who had suffered so terribly from an evil that was as unexpected as it was unimaginable in its enormity. But the worst was not yet. More dreadful than the actual suffering and scenes of death and devastation which overspread the afflicted lands was the profound mental and moral depression that followed. This was shared even by those who had not seen the Martians and had not witnessed the destructive effects of the frightful engines of war they'd imported for the conquest of the earth. All mankind was sunk deep in this universal despair, and it became tenfold blacker when the astronomers announced from their observatories that strange lights were visible, moving and flashing upon the red surface of the planet of war. These mysterious appearances could only be interpreted in the light of past experience to mean that the Martians were preparing for another invasion of the Earth, and who could doubt that with the invincible powers of destruction at their command, they would this time make their work complete and final. It was a startling announcement. This startling announcement was the more pitiable in its effects because it served to unnerve and discourage those few of stouter hearts and more hopeful temperaments who had already begun the labor of restoration and reconstruction amid the embers of their desolated homes. In New York, this feeling of hope and confidence, this determination to rise against disaster and wipe out the evidences of its dreadful presence as quickly as possible, that had manifested itself. Already a company had been formed and a large amount of capital subscribed for the reconstruction of the destroyed buildings, or rather the destroyed bridges over the East River. Already, architects were busily at work planning new 20-story hotels and apartment houses, new churches, and new cathedrals on a greater scale than before. The Martians returning. Amid this stir of renewed life came the fatal news that Mars was undoubtedly preparing to deal us a death blow. The sudden revulsion of feeling flitted like the shadow of an eclipse over the earth. The scenes that followed were indescribable. Men lost their reason. The faint-hearted ended the suspense with self-destruction. The stout-hearted remained steadfast, but without hope, and knowing not what to do. But there was a gleam of hope of which the general public was as yet knew nothing. It was due to a few dauntless men of science, conspicuous among whom were Lord Kelvin, the great English savant, Herr Röntgen, the discoverer of the famous X-ray, and especially Thomas A. Edison, the American genius of science. Those air quotes were editorial, by the way. These men and a few others had examined with the utmost care the engines of war, the flying machines, the generators of mysterious destructive forces that the Martians had produced, with the object of discovering, if possible, the sources of their power. Suddenly, from Mr. Edison's laboratory at Orange, flashed the startling intelligence that he had not only discovered the manner in which the invaders had been able to produce the mighty energies which they employed with such terrible effect, but that going further, he had found a way to overcome them. The glad news was quickly circulated throughout the civilized world. Luckily, the Atlantic cables had not been destroyed by the Martians, so that communication between the eastern and western continents was uninterrupted. It was a proud day for America. Even while the Martians had been upon the earth, carrying everything before them, demonstrating to the confusion of the most optimistic, there was no possibility of standing against them. A feeling, a confidence had manifested itself in France, to a minor extent in England, and particularly in Russia, that the Americans might discover means to meet and master the invaders. Now it seemed this hope and expectation were to be realized. Too late, it is true in a certain sense, but not too late to meet the new invasion which the astronomers had announced was impending. The effect was as wonderful and indescribable as that of the despondency which, but a little while before, had overspread the world. One could almost hear the universal sigh of relief which went up from humanity. To relief succeeded confidence. So quickly does the human spirit recover like an elastic spring when pressure is released. We are ready for them. Let them come, was the almost joyous cry. We shall be ready for them now. The Americans have solved the problem. Edison has placed the means of victory within our power. Looking back upon that time now, I recall with a thrill the pride that stirred me at the thought that, after all, these inhabitants of the earth were a match for those terrible men from Mars, despite their distinct advantage which they had gained from millions of years of prior civilization and science. As good fortunes, like bad, never come singly, the news of Mr. Edison's discovery was quickly followed by additional glad tidings from that laboratory of marvels in the lap of the Orange Mountains. During their career of conquest, the Martians had astonished the inhabitants of the earth no less with their flying machines, which navigated our atmosphere as easily as they had of that of their native planet, than with their more destructive inventions. These flying machines themselves had given them an enormous advantage in the contest, high above the desolation that had caused to reign on the surface of the earth, and, out of the range of our guns, they'd hung safe in the upper air. From the clouds they'd dropped death upon the earth. Now rumor declared that Mr. Edison had invented and perfected a flying machine much more complete and manageable than those of the Martians had been. Wonderful stories quickly found their way into the newspapers concerning what Mr. Edison already accomplished with the aid of his model electrical balloon. His laboratory was rightfully guarded against the invasion of the curious because he rightly felt that a premature announcement, which should promise more than could actually be fulfilled, would, at this critical juncture, plunge mankind back again into the gulf of despair out of which it had just begun to emerge. Nevertheless, inklings of the truth leaked out. The flying machine had been seen by many persons hovering by night high above the Orange Hills and disappearing in the faint starlight, as if it had gone away into the depths of space, out of which it would re-emerge before the morning light had streaked the east, and be seen settling down again within the walls that surrounded the laboratory of the great inventor. At length, the rumor, gradually deepening into conviction, spread that Edison himself, accompanied by a few scientific friends, had made an experimental trip to the moon. At a time when the spirit of mankind was less profoundly stirred, such a story would have been received with complete incredulity, but now, rising on the wings of the new hope that was buoying up the earth, This extraordinary rumor became a day-star of truth to the nations. A trip to the moon. And it was true. I had myself been one of the occupants of the car of the flying ship of space on that night when it silently left the earth and, rising out of the great shadow of the globe, sped on to the moon. Ooh, there's a illustration. Edison's wonderful invention appears. The flying machine had been seen by many persons hovering by night high above the orange hills and disappearing in the faint starlight. We had landed upon the scarred and desolate face of the Earth's satellite, and but that there are greater and more interesting events, the telling of which must not be delayed, I should undertake to describe the particulars of this first visit of men to another world. But as I've already intimated, this was merely an experimental trip. By visiting this little nearby island in the ocean of space, Mr. Edison simply wished to demonstrate the practicability of his invention, and to convince, first of all, himself and his scientific friends that it was possible for men, mortal men even, to quit and revisit the earth at their will. That aim this experimental trip triumphantly attained. There's another illustration, the trial trip to the moon. I had myself been one of the occupants of the car of the flying ship of space on that night when it silently left the earth and, rising out of the great shadow of the globe, sped on to the moon. It would carry me into technical details that would hardly interest the reader to describe the mechanism of Mr. Edison's flying machine. Let it suffice to say that it depended upon the principle of electrical attraction and repulsion. By means of a most ingenious and complicated construction, it mastered the problem of how to produce, in a limited space, electricity of any desired potential and of any polarity, and that without danger to the experimenter or to the material experimented upon. It is gravitation, as everybody knows, that makes man a prisoner on this earth. If he could overcome or neutralize the gravitation, he would float away, a free creature of interstellar space. Mr. Edison in his invention had pitted electricity against gravitation. Nature, in fact, had done the same thing long before. Every astronomer knew this, but none had been able to imitate or reproduce this miracle of nature. When a comet approaches the sun, the orbit in which it travels indicates that it's moving under the impulse of the sun's gravitation. It is in reality falling in a great parabolic or elliptical curve through space, but while a comet approaches the sun, it begins to display, stretching out for millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of miles, on the side away from the sun, an immense luminous train called its tail. This train extends back into that part of space which the comet is moving. Thus, the sun at one and the same time is drawing the comet toward itself and driving off from the comet in an opposite direction minute particles or atoms, which, instead of obeying the gravitational force, are plainly compelled to disobey it. That this energy, which the sun exercises against its own gravitation, is electrical in nature, hardly anyone will doubt. The head of the comet, being comparatively heavy and massive, falls on toward the sun despite the repulsion. But the atoms which form the tail, being almost without weight, yield to the electrical rather than the gravitational influence, and so fly away to the sun. Oh, excuse me. Apologies for the yawn there. While we're at a breather, though, I should note, this is actually, I went into this with the assumption that it being an unauthorized sequel to The War of the Worlds, that I would know 100% of what's going on, but it seems like the book that this is jumping off from, which is separate from War of the Worlds, actually, um, essentially it sets the alien invasion in a different place. We may or may not remember that uh, the original War of the Worlds took place in England and the areas surrounding. Um, but instead, the Fighters from Mars, which is the book that this is a sequel to, is an edited version in which it takes place in America? Question mark. New York, the New York area, even. Uh, while we're on the topic, the first version, per Wikipedia, appeared in the New York Evening Journal between December 5th, 1897 and January 11th, 1898. Ah, okay. Wikipedia here. I'm looking this up now. The editors of this version changed the setting to the local area where the newspapers were on sale, and also edited out most of the passages containing science details, and problematic actions by the narrator. Even though they're considered unauthorized, it does seem Wells may have inadvertently given the go-ahead on the versions, as can be seen from a letter that was published in the magazine The Critic in March 1898, where Wells states that yet it is possible that this affair is not so much downright wickedness as much as a terrible mistake. Interesting. That's really interesting. So this is branching off of the should still play we should still play the Wells drinking game, Kariki. You're correct. See once see once what we have there. So this is branching off of the New York Evening Journal version of Fighters from Mars rather than the second version from Boston, uh, which came a little bit later. I did not know this. This is actually really interesting. And I might go back and read Fighters from Mars in my own time. I just heard about uh excuse me. I just heard about Edison's conquest of Mars and some of the surrounding details. So that's actually really neat. By the way, Gariki brings up the Wells drinking game. Uh, if you hear any of the following, take a drink. I prefer water, but if you want to get obliterated, you could drink alcohol. But I don't suggest it. Drink responsibly, darn you. Um, anyway, if you hear any of the following words, take a drink. Tumult, zenith, for a space, terrible, and peculiar. So keep an eye out for those words. You you may or may not hear them, depending on how aggressively service here is emulating Wells's writing. We'll find out, won't we? I am certainly going to be drinking water for this. Not only because I do not drink alcohol, but also because if I did drink alcohol, I would not be conscious enough to finish this stream during a H.G. Wells book. So I heartily recommend hydration. It's good for you. Anyway, gravity overcome. Now, what Mr. Edison had done was, in effect, to create an electrified particle which might be compared to one of the atoms composing the tail of a comet, although in reality it was kind of a car of metal, weighing some hundreds of pounds and capable of bearing some thousands of pounds with it in its flight. By producing, with the aid of the electrical generator contained in this car, an enormous charge of electricity, Mr. Edison was able to counterbalance, and a trifle more than counterbalance, the attraction of the earth, and thus cause the car to fly off from the earth as an electrified pith ball flies from the prime conductor. As we sat in the brilliantly lighted chamber that formed the interior of the car, and where stores of compressed air had been provided, together with chemical apparatus, uh, by the means of which fresh supplies of oxygen and nitrogen might be obtained for our consumption during the flight through space, Mr. Edison touched a polished button, thus causing the generation of the required electrical charge on the exterior of the car, and immediately we began to rise. The moment and direction of our flight had been so timed and prearranged that the original impulse would carry us straight toward the moon. Really good point, Gariki. The stream elements output doesn't show up in the chat display on stream. Once again, if you hear any of the following, take a drink. tumult, zenith, for space, terrible, and peculiar. And again, I cannot stress enough, you will want to be doing this with water if service is anything like wells. Anyway. When we fell within the sphere of attraction of that orb, it only became necessary to so manipulate the electrical charge upon our car as nearly, but not quite, to counterbalance the effect of the moon's attraction, in order that we might gradually approach it, and with an easy motion settle without shock upon its surface. We did not remain to observe the wonders of the moon, although we could not fail to observe that many curious things therein. Having demonstrated the fact that we could not only leave the Earth, but journey through space and safely land upon the surface of another planet, Mr. Edison's immediate purpose was fulfilled, and we hastened back to the Earth, employing, in leaving the moon and landing again upon our own planet, the same means of control over the electrical attraction and repulsion between the respective planets and our car, which has already been described. When the actual experiment had thus demonstrated the practicability of the invention, Mr. Edison no longer withheld the news of what he'd been doing from the world. The telegraph lines and the ocean cables labored with the messages that in endless succession, and burdened with an infinity of detail, were sent all over the earth. Everywhere the utmost enthusiasm was aroused. "Let the Martians come," was the cry. "If necessary, we can quit the earth as the Athenians fled from Athens before the advancing host of Xerxes, and like them take refuge upon our ships, these new ships of space with which American inventiveness has furnished us." And then, like a flash, some genius struck out an idea that fired the world. "Why should we wait? Why should we run the risk of having our cities destroyed and our lands desolated a second time? Let us go to Mars. We have the means. Let us beard the lion in his den. Let us ourselves turn conquerors and take possession of that detestable planet, and if necessary, destroy it in order to relieve the earth of this perpetual threat which now hangs over us like the sword of Damocles." Oh, there's another illustration. The wizard and astronomer confer. A consultation in Wizard Edison's laboratory between him and Professor Service on the best means of repaying the damage wrought upon this planet by the Martians. Hang on. Professor Service, is this a self-insert story too? Does this man just like stroll in and like, "Hi, I met my favorite guy, Thomas Edison, and then he did all these cool things. This is fun. This is really fun, like immediately." Excuse me. Let's dive into chapter 2, shall we? This enthusiasm would have had but little justification had Mr. Edison done nothing more than invent a machine which could navigate the atmosphere and the regions of interplanetary space. He had, however, and this fact was generally known, although the details had not yet leaked out, invented also machines of war, intended to meet the utmost that the Martians could do for either offense or defense in the struggle which was now about to ensue. Acting upon the hint which had been conveyed from various investigations in the domains of physics, and concentrating upon the problem all those unmatched powers of intellect which distinguished him, the great inventor had succeeded in producing a little implement which one could carry in his hand, but which was more powerful than any battleship that had ever floated. The details of its mechanism could not be easily explained, not without the use of tedious technicalities, the employment of terms, diagrams, mathematical statements, all of which would lie outside the scope of this narrative. But the principle of the thing was simple enough. It was upon the great scientific doctrine, which we have seen so completely and brilliantly developed, of the law of harmonic vibrations, extending from atoms and molecules at one end of the series up to worlds and suns at the other end, that Mr. Edison based his invention. You see, every kind of substance has its own vibratory rhythm. That of iron differs from that of pine wood. The atoms of gold do not vibrate at the same time or through the same range as those of lead, and so on for all known substances and all the chemical elements. So, on a larger scale, every massive body has its period of vibration. A great suspension bridge vibrates under the impulsive forces that are applied to it in long periods. No company of soldiers ever crosses such a bridge without breaking step. If they tramped together and were followed by other companies, keeping the same time with their feet, after a while the vibrations of the bridge would become so great and so destructive that it would fall in pieces. So, any structure, if its vibration rate is known, could be easily destroyed by a force applied to it in such a way that it could simply increase the swing of those vibrations up to the point of destruction. Now, Mr. Edison had been able to ascertain the vibratory swing of many well-known substances, and to produce, by means of the instrument which he had contrived, pulsations in the ether which were completely under his control, and which could be made long or short, quick or slow, at his will. He could run through the whole gamut from the slow vibrations of sound in air up to the 425 millions of vibrations per second of the ultra-red rays. Having obtained an instrument of such power, it only remained to concentrate its energy upon a given object in order that the atoms composing that object should be set into violent undulation, sufficient to burst it asunder and scatter its molecules broadcast. This the inventor effected by the simplest means in the world, simply a parabolic reflector by which the destructive waves could be sent like a beam of light, but invisible, in any direction, and could be focused upon any desired point. I had the good fortune to be present when this powerful engine of destruction was submitted to its first test. We'd gone upon the roof of Mr. Edison's laboratory, and the inventor held the little instrument with its attached mirror in his hand. We looked about for some object on which to try its powers. On the bare limb of a tree not far away, for it was late in the fall, sat a disconsolate crow. "Good, that will do," said Mr. Edison. He touched a button at the side of the instrument, and a soft whirring noise was heard. "Feathers," said Mr. Edison, "have a vibration period of 386 million per second." He adjusted the index as he spoke. Then, through a sighting tube, he aimed at the bird. "Now watch this." Another soft whir in the instrument, a momentary flash of light around it, and behold, the crow had turned from black to white. "Its feathers are gone. They've been dissipated in their constituent atoms. Now we'll finish the crow." There's an illustration of the crow being defeathered here. Instantly there was another adjustment of the index, another outshooting of vibratory force, a rapid up and down motion in the index to include a certain range of vibrations, and the crow itself was gone, vanished in empty space. There was the bare twig on which a moment before it had stood. Behind, in the sky, was the white cloud against which its black form had been sharply outlined, but there was no more crow. "Excuse me, Magnus. Hi. You can't release the bogus down there, man. That won't end well." "Yeah, we've talked about this. You can't pick at the mattress. You'll release the bogus. Hi. Hello. Pep pep pep." Pretty welcome, Magnus. He's here. Ugh. I'm very prone to yawns this fine evening. I might have to stand up for a time. We'll see. Ugh. Oh, hi. Hello. Do you want to come sit on my lap? Is that what you're tapping my arm for? Come here. Come on. He's like, "No, this is not what I wanted." This is what you get. This is what you get. You get held, and you get petted. I know, it's the end of the world for the poor little kitty cat. Yes, Dad is so mean to you. Pick you up, pet you. can stay right there as long as you'd like, sir. And that looks bad for the Martians, doesn't it? Said the wizard. I have ascertained the vibration rate of all the materials of which their war engines, whose remains we've collected together, are composed. They can be shattered into nothingness in the fraction of a second. Even if the vibration period were not known, it could quickly be hit upon by simply running through the gamut. Huzzah! Cried one of the outlookers. We've met the Martians! They're ours! Such, in brief, was the first of contrivances which Mr. Edison invented for the approaching war with Mars. And these facts had become widely known. Additional experiments had completed the demonstration of the inventor's ability, with the aid of his wonderful instrument, to destroy any given object, or any given part of an object, provided that that part differed in its atomic constitution, and consequently in its vibratory period, from the other parts. A most impressive public exhibition of the powers of this little disintegrator was given amid the ruins of New York. On Lower Broadway, a part of the walls of one of the gigantic buildings, which had been destroyed by the Martians, impended in such a manner that it threatened at any moment to fall upon the heads of passers-by. The fire department didn't dare touch it. To blow it up seemed a dangerous expedient, because already new buildings had been erected in its neighborhood, and their safety would be imperiled by the flying fragments. The fact happened to come to my knowledge. Here's an opportunity, I said to Mr. Edison, to try the powers of your machine on a large scale. Capital, he instantly replied. I shall go at once. For the work now in hand, it was necessary to employ a battery of disintegrators, since the field of destruction covered by each was comparatively limited. All of the impending portions of the wall must be destroyed at once and together, for otherwise the danger would rather be accentuated than annihilated. The disintegrators were placed upon the roof of a neighboring building, so adjusted that their fields of destruction overlapped one another upon the wall. Their indexes were all set to correspond with the vibration period of the peculiar kind of brick with which the wall consisted. Then the energy was turned on, and a shout of wonder arose from the multitudes which had assembled at safe distance to witness the experiment. Only a cloud remained. The wall did not fall. It did not break asunder. No fragments shot this way and that and high in the air. There was no explosion, no shock, no noise. Nothing to disturb the still atmosphere, only a soft whir that seemed to pervade everything and to tingle in the nerves of the spectators. And then what had been was not. And then what had been was not. The wall was gone, but high above and all around the place where it hung over the street with its threat of death, there appeared, a swiftly billowing outward in every direction, bluish, faint cloud. It was the scattered atoms of the destroyed wall. Oh, so they're literally giving him they're like literally saying, oh yeah, they have a disintegration rate, like an honest to goodness 30s pulp disintegration ray. Wild. There is an illustration of the wall getting disintegrated here. And now the cry, "On to Mars," was heard on all sides. But for such an enterprise, funds were needed, millions upon millions even. Yet some of the fairest and richest portions of the earth had been impoverished by the frightful ravages of those enemies who had dropped down upon them from the skies. Still, the money must be had. The salvation of the planet, as everybody was now convinced, depended upon the successful negotiation of a gigantic war fund, in comparison with which all the expenditures and all the wars that had been waged by the nations for 2,000 years would be insignificant. The electrical ships and vibration engines must be constructed by scores and thousands. Only Mr. Edison's immense resources and unrivaled equipment had enabled him to make the models whose powers had been so satisfactorily shown. But to multiply these upon a war scale was not only beyond the resources of any individual, hardly a nation on the globe, in the period of its greatest prosperity, could have undertaken such a work. All the nations, then, must now conjoin. They must unite their resources, and, if necessary, exhaust all their hoards, in order to raise the needed sum. Negotiations were at it once again. The United States naturally took the lead, and their leadership was never for a moment questioned abroad. Washington was selected as the place of meeting for a great Congress of the Nations. Washington, luckily, had been one of the places that had not been touched by the Martians, but if Washington had been a city composed of hotels alone, and every hotel so great as to be a little city in itself, it would have been utterly insignificant for the accommodation of the innumerable throngs which now flocked to the banks of the Potomac. But when was American enterprise unequal to a crisis? The necessary hotels, lodging houses, and restaurants were constructed with astounding rapidity. One could see the city growing and expanding day by day, week by week. It flowed over Georgetown Heights, it leaped the Potomac, it spread east and west, north and south. Square mile after square mile of territory was buried under the advancing buildings until the giant city, which had thus grown up like a mushroom in the night, was fully capable of accommodating all its expected guests. At first it had been intended that the heads of the various governments should attend in person this universal congress, but as the enterprise went on, the enthusiasm spread, as the necessity for haste became more apparent through the warning notes which were constantly sounded from the observatories, where the astronomers were nightly beholding new evidences of threatening preparations in Mars. The kings and queens of that old world felt that they could not remain at home. Their proper pa- that their proper place was the new focus and center of the whole world, as in the city of Washington. Without concerted action, or without concerted action, without without interchange of suggestion, this impulse seemed to seize all the old world monarchs at once. William, Tsar Nicholas, Alfonso of Spain. Oh, I skipped a couple lines. Without concerted action, without interchange of suggestion, this impulse seemed to seize all the old world monarchs at once. Suddenly, cablegrams flashed to the government at Washington, announcing that Queen Victoria, the Emperor William, Tsar Nicholas, Alfonso of Spain, with his mother, Maria Christina, the old Emperor Francis Joseph, and the elder. I keep losing my place. All these names, I'm like, oh. Suddenly, cablegrams flashed to the government at Washington announcing that Queen Victoria, the Emperor William, Tsar Nicholas, Alfonso of Spain with his mother Maria Christina, the old Emperor Francis Joseph, and the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, King Oscar and Queen Sophia of Sweden and Norway, King Humbert and Queen Margarita of Italy, King George and Queen Olga of Greece, Abdul Hamid of Turkey, Caizhen, Emperor of China, Mutsushito, the Japanese Mikado, with his beautiful Princess Haruko, the President of France, the President of Switzerland, the first syndic of the little Republic of Andorra, perched on the crest of the Pyrenees, and the heads of all the Central and South American republics were coming to Washington to take part in the deliberations which, it felt, was to settle the fate of Earth and Mars besides. One day after this announcement had been received and the additional news had come that nearly all the visiting monarchs had set out, attended by brilliant suites and conveyed by fleets of warships for their destination, some coming across the Atlantic to the port of New York, and others across the Pacific to San Francisco, Mr. Edison said to me, "Well, this would be a fine spectacle. Do you want to watch it?" "Certainly," I replied. Oh, goodness gracious. I knew I slept poorly today. I did not know it was this poorly. You'll have to excuse me. I think I'm going to stand. Not unsupported, mind you, but stand I shall. A grand spectacle. The ship of space was immediately at our disposal. I think I have not yet mentioned the fact that the inventor's control over the electrical generator carried in the car was so perfect that by varying the potential or changing the polarity, he could cause it slowly or swiftly, as might be desired, to approach or recede from any object. The only practical difficulty was presented when the polarity of the electrical charge upon an object in the neighborhood of the car was unknown to those in the car, and happened to be the opposite to that of the charge which the car at the particular moment was bearing. In such a case, of course, the car would fly toward the object, wherever it might be, like a pithball or a feather, attracted to the knob of an electrical machine. In this way, considerable danger was occasionally encountered, and a few accidents could not be avoided. Hang on. Am I thinking of the right thing when they say pithball? Pithball. Because it's been mentioned multiple times. Pithballs are little styrofoam or similar material. Oh, you can't hear Magnus crinkling the bag. Hey, buddy. Hey, hi. Can Dad borrow the crinkle bag for a little bit? Hi. Yes. Normally you are allowed to crinkle the bag. This is a reasonable point that you have made, but crinkle bag during podcast is not a good idea. Crinkle bag later, okay? He's like, no, my crinkle bag. He looks so scandalized. Pithball, little styrofoam or similar material balls coated in conductive paint. So they're just kind of little conductive, kind of. I'm picturing like little styrofoam balls with like tinfoil. You know, it's like a little ball that they hang off of like a piece of fishing line or something, and it moves in reaction to electric charges. So I was not incorrect in what I was picturing. I was worried when they mentioned pitball twice. I was expecting like the little, you know how like a Van de Graaff generator sometimes it has a little like handheld wand with a little metal ball on it that you can use to like generate the opposite charge of what the main bulb does. I was worried that was what was going on there, but no. Pithball are like little styrofoam ball, basically coated in tinfoil, and they just kind of warm in reaction to electricity. Anyway, danger is where we were. Fortunately, however, such cases were rare. It was only now and then that, owing to some local cause, electrical polarities unknown or unexpected by the navigators endangered the safety of the car. As I shall have occasion to relate, however, in the course of the narrative, this danger became more acute and assumed at times a most formidable phase when we ventured outside the sphere of the earth and were moving through the unexplored regions beyond. On this occasion, having embarked, we rose rapidly to a height of some thousands of feet, and directed our course over the Atlantic, when, halfway to Ireland, we beheld, in the distance, steaming westward, the smoke of several fleets. As we drew nearer, a marvellous spectacle unfolded itself to our eyes. From the northeast, their great guns flashing in the sunlight, and their huge funnels belching black volumes that rested like thunderclouds upon the sea, came the mighty warships of England, with her meteor flags streaming red in the breeze, while the royal insignia, indicating the presence of the ruler of the British Empire, was conspicuously displayed upon the flagship of the squadron. Following a course more directly westward, appeared under another black cloud of smoke the hulls and guns and burgeons of another great fleet, carrying the tricolour of France and bearing in its midst the head of the magnificent Republic of Western Europe. Further south, beating up against the northerly winds, came a third fleet with the gold and red of Spain fluttering from its masthead. This, too, was carrying its king westward, where now indeed the star of empire had taken its way. Rising a little higher, so as to extend our horizon, we saw coming down the English Channel behind the British fleet the black ships of Russia. Side by side, or following one another's lead, these war fleets were on a peaceful voyage that belied their threatening appearance. There had been no thought of danger to or from the forts and ports of rival nations which they passed. There was no enmity and no fear between them, when the throats of their ponderous guns yawned at one another across the waves. They were now, in spirit, all one fleet, having one object, bearing against one enemy, ready to defend but one country, and that country, of course, was the entire earth. It was some time before we caught sight of the Emperor William's fleet. It seems that the Kaiser, although at first consenting to the arrangement by which Washington had been selected as the assembling place for the nations, afterwards objected to it. "I ought to do this thing myself," he had said. "My glorious ancestors would never have consented to allow these upstart republicans to lead in a warlike enterprise of this kind. What would my grandfather have said to it? I suspect that it is some scheme aimed at the divine right of kings." But the good sense of the German people would not suffer their ruler to place them in a position so false and so untenable. And, swept along by their enthusiasm, the Kaiser at last consented to embark on his flagship at Kiel, and now he was following the other fleets on their great mission to the western continent. Why did they bring their warships when their intentions were peaceable, do you ask? Well, it was partly the effect of ancient habit, and partly due to the fact that such multitudes of officials and members of ruling families wished to embark for Washington that the ordinary means of ocean communication would have been utterly inadequate to convey them. After we had feasted our eyes on this strange sight, Mr. Edison suddenly exclaimed, "Now let us see the fellows from the rising sun." The car was immediately directed toward the west. We rapidly approached the American coast, and as we sailed over the Allegheny Mountains and the broad plains of the Ohio and the Mississippi, we saw crawling beneath us from west, south, and north an endless succession of railway trains bearing their multitudes on to Washington. With marvelous speed we rushed westward, rising high to skim over the snow-topped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, and then the glittering rim of the Pacific was before us. Halfway between the American coast and Hawaii, we met the fleets coming from China and Japan. Side by side they were plowing the main, having forgotten or laid aside all the animosities of their former wars. I well remember how my heart was stirred at this impressive exhibition of the boundless influence which my country had come to exercise over all the people of the world, and I turned to look at the man whose genius this uprising of the earth was due, but Mr. Edison, after his wont, appeared totally unconscious of the fact that he was personally responsible for what was going on. His mind, seemingly, was entirely absorbed in considering problems, the solution of which might be essential to our success in the terrific struggle which was soon to begin. "Well, have you seen enough? Then let us go back to Washington," he said. As we speeded back across the continent, we held beneath us again the burdened express trains rushing toward the Atlantic, and thousands and hundreds of thousands of upturned eyes watching at our swift progress, volleys of cheers reaching our ears, for everyone knew that this was Edison's electrical warship, on which the hope of the nation and the hopes of all the nations indeed depended. These scenes were repeated again and again until the car hovered over the still expanding capital on the Potomac, where the unceasing ring of hammers rose to the clouds. One moment. Sorry, there was a thing off screen that was bad. Oh. Okay. Chapter 3. The day appointed for the assembling of the nations in Washington opened, bright and beautiful. Arrangements had been made for the reception of the distinguished guests at the Capitol. No time was to be wasted, and having assembled in the Senate chamber, no time was to be wasted in having assembled in the Senate chamber, the business that had called them together was to be immediately begun. The scene in Pennsylvania Avenue, when the procession of dignitaries and royalties passed up toward the Capitol, was one never to be forgotten. Bands were playing, magnificent equipages flashed in the morning sunlight. The flags of every nation on the earth fluttered in the breeze. Queen Victoria, with the Prince of Wales escorting her and riding in an open carriage, was greeted with roars of cheers. The Emperor William, following in another carriage, with Empress Victoria at his side, condescended to bow and smile in response to the greetings of a free people. Each of the other monarchs was received in a similar manner. The Tsar of Russia proved to be an especial favorite with the multitude on account of the ancient friendship of his house for America. But the greatest applause of all came when the President of France, followed by the President of Switzerland and the first syndic of the Republic of Andorra, made their appearance. Equally warm were the greetings extended to the representatives of Mexico and the South American states. The Sultan of Turkey, however, the crowd apparently hardly knew at first how to receive the Sultan of Turkey, but the universal good feeling was in his favor, and finally rounds of hand-clapping and cheers greeted his progress along the splendid avenue. A happy idea had apparently occurred to the Emperor of China and the Mikado of Japan, for, attended by their intermingled suites, they rode together in a single carriage. This object lesson in the unity of international feeling immensely pleased the spectators. This made an unparalleled scene. The scene that was in the Senate chamber stirred everyone profoundly. That it was brilliant and magnificent goes without saying, but there was a seriousness and intense feeling of expectancy pervading both those who looked on and those who were to do the work for those which these magnates of the earth had assembled, which produced an ineradicable impression. The President of the United States, of course, presided. Representatives of the greater powers occupied the front seats, and some of them were honored with special chairs near the President. No time was wasted in preliminaries. The President made a brief speech. "We have come together to consider a question that equally interests the whole earth. I need not remind you that unexpectedly and without provocation on our part, the people, the monsters, I should rather say, of Mars, recently came down upon the earth, attacked us in our homes, and spread desolation around them. Having the advantage of ages above evolution, which for us are yet in the future, they brought with them engines of death and of destruction against which we found it impossible to contend. It is within the memory of everyone in reach of my voice that it was through the entirely unexpected succor which Providence sent us that we were suddenly and effectually freed from the invaders. By our own efforts we could have done nothing." McKinley's tribute continued. But, as you all know, the first feeling of relief which followed the death of our foes was quickly succeeded by the fearful news which came to us from the observatories, that the Martians were undoubtedly preparing for a second invasion of our planet. Against this we should have had no recourse, and no hope but for the genius of one of my countrymen, who, as you are all aware, has perfected means which may enable us to not only withstand the attack of these awful enemies, but to meet them, and, let us hope, to conquer them on their own ground. Mr. Edison is here to explain to you what those means are, but we also have another object. Whether we send a fleet of interplanetary ships to invade Mars, or whether we simply confine our attention to works of defense, in either case it will be necessary to raise a very large sum of money. None of us has yet recovered from the effects of that recent invasion. The earth is poor today compared to its position a few years ago, yet we cannot allow our poverty to stand in our way. The money, the means, they must be had. It will be part of our business here to raise a gigantic war fund by the aid of which we can construct the equipment and machinery that we shall require. This, I think, is all I need to say. Let us proceed to business." "Where's Mr. Edison?" cried a voice. Will Mr. Edison please step forward? There was a great stir in the assembly, and the iron-gray head of the great inventor was seen moving through the crowd. In his hand he carried one of the marvelous disintegrators. He was requested to explain and illustrate his operation, and Mr. Edison smiled. There's an illustration of Edison working his way through the crowd of the many dignitaries. Edison to the rescue. I can explain its details to Lord Kelvin, for instance, but if their majesties will excuse me, I doubt whether I can make it plain to their crowned heads. The Emperor William smiled superciliously. Apparently he thought that another assault had been committed upon the divine right of kings, but the Tsar Nicholas appeared to be amused, and the Emperor of China, who had been studying English, laughed in his sleeve, as if he suspected that a joke had been perpetuated. I think, said one of the deputies, a simple exhibition of the powers of this instrument, without a technical explanation of the method of its working, I believe will suffice for our purpose. The suggestion was immediately approved. In response to it, Mr. Edison, by a few simple experiments, showed how he could quickly and certainly shatter into its constituent atoms any object upon which the vibratory force of the disintegrator should be directed. In this manner he caused an inkstand to disappear under the very nose of Emperor William without a spot of ink being scattered upon his sacred person, but evidently the odor of the disunited atoms was not agreeable to the nostrils of the Kaiser. Mr. Edison also explained in general terms the principle on which the instrument worked. He was greeted with round after round of applause, and the spirit of the assembly rose high. Next, the workings of the electrical ship were explained, and it was announced that after the meeting had adjourned, an exhibition of the flying powers of the ship would be given in the open air. These experiments, together with the accompanying explanations, added to what had already been disseminated through the public press, were quite sufficient to convince all the representatives who had assembled in Washington that the problem of how to conquer the Martians had been solved. The means were plainly at hand, it only remained to apply them. For this purpose, as the president had pointed out, it would be necessary to raise a very large sum of money. How much would be needed? Asked one of the English representatives. At least $10,000 million, replied the president. It would be safer, said a senator from the Pacific coast, to make it 25,000 millions. I suggest, said the King of Italy, that the nations be called in alphabetical order, and that the representatives of each name a sum which it is ready and able to contribute. We want the cash or its equivalent, shouted the Pacific Coast senator. I shall not follow the alphabet strictly, said the president, but shall begin with the larger nations first. Perhaps under the circumstances it is proper that the United States should lead the way. Mr. Secretary, he continued, turning to the Secretary of the Treasury, how much can we stand? At least 1,000 millions, replied the Secretary of the Treasury. A roar of applause that shook the room burst from the assembly. Even some of the monarchs threw up their hats. The Emperor Tsitsen smiled from ear to ear. One of the Rokotuis, or native chiefs from Fiji, sprang up and brandished a war club. Okay, there have been several things that I've been like, oh, I don't like that. But, like, that particular description of enthusiasm, I'm going to call it there. We have time to disclaimer an hour, which is, less far than I thought this book was gonna make. In a nutshell, Paper Cuts is primarily public domain stuff. Some of it has not aged well. I'll be doing my best to warn you, but I'm not changing any of it on the fly. I'm not in a position to be performing censorship. There is a wider disclaimer available to the podcast listener in the show notes, or to the live listener down in my About page, or amongst my panels, as it were. Like I said, in short, some of these are old, and you're not you may find things objectionable within them. Uh, Sometimes that's the point. You know, a lot of these older novels, uh, to put it in very broad internet fandom terms, have Blorbo from my novel, who you do not wish to be, do not commit the crimes of the Blorbo. um, but to put it a bit more on the nose, often these protagonists are cautionary tales as to things that they would not like you to do. They being the author and the general public of the time. And sometimes, you know, there's just stuff that was less objectionable in its time, and now we're just kind of like, what? But you know, that's what happens when we read things this old. I I am of the firm belief that there are good, even great aspects of this beyond that, and that's why I showcase them. Anyway, that point made, let's continue. The president then proceeded to call the other nations, beginning with Austria-Hungary and ending with Zanzibar, whose Sultan, Hamoud bin Mohammed, had come to the Congress in the escort of Queen Victoria. Each contributed liberally. Germany, coming in alphabetical order just before Great Britain, had named, through its chancellor, the sum of $500 million. But when the First Lord of the British Treasury, not wishing to be behind the United States, named double that sum as the contribution of the British Empire, the Emperor William looked displeased. He spoke a word in the ear of the Chancellor, who immediately raised his hand. "We will give $1,000 million," said the Chancellor. Queen Victoria seemed surprised, though not displeased. The First Lord of the Treasury met her eye, and then, rising in his place, said, "Make it 1,500 million for the Great Britain." Emperor William consulted again with his chancellor, but evidently concluded not to increase his bid. But at any rate, the fund had benefited to the amount of 1,000 millions by this little outburst of imperial rivalry. The greatest surprise of all, however, came when the King of Siam was called upon for his contribution. He had not been given a foremost place in the Congress, but when the name of his country was pronounced, he rose by his chair, dressed in a gorgeous specimen of the peculiar attire of his country, then slowly pushed his way up to the front, stepped up to the president's desk, and deposited upon it a small box. "This is our contribution," he said in broken English. The cover was lifted, and there darted, shimmering in the half gloom of the chamber, a burst of iridescence from the box. A long lost treasure. "My friends of the Western world," continued the King of Siam, "will be interested in seeing this gem. Only once before has the eye of a European been blessed with the sight of it. Your books will tell you that in the 17th century a traveler, Tavernier, saw in India an unmatched diamond which had afterward disappeared like a meteor, and was thought to have been lost from the earth. You all know the name of that diamond and its history. It is the Great Mogul, and it lies before you. How it came into my possession I shall not explain. At any rate, it is honestly mine, and I freely contribute it here, in aid to protect my native planet against those enemies who appear determined to destroy it." There's an illustration of the King of Siam contributing this giant diamond. Is this a real thing, or is this something that the author has made up? Let's real quick. Mogul Diamond. The Great Mogul Diamond was a large diamond that is believed to have been discovered around 1650, most probably around the Kolar Mine, in the Golconda region of southern India. Tavernier described the diamond as if the stone is of the same form as if one cut an egg through the middle. The 787-carat rough diamond was gifted by Emir Yemia to Shah Jahan, the fifth Mughal emperor, as part of diplomacy between the two families. A Venetian lapidary, or Ortensio Borgio, was assigned to cut the stone, It exhibited several inclusions, rejecting the idea of cutting the diamond into several fine stones. Borgio decided to address the inclusion problem by grinding away at it until the unwanted flaws were gone. Much to the horror of the emperor, Borgio's work yielded very poor results, including a great loss of weight, fining him 10,000 rupees, all the money that Borgia had, for his ineptitude, etc., etc. It's actually mentioned on the Wikipedia page as showing up in this book. So, for context, we're talking about a 787 carat diamond here. That was at the time of writing of the novel. That the stone was had disappeared after the assassination of Persian ruler Nadir Shah in 1739. Or rather, he was assassinated in 1747 and the stone disappeared from there. Interesting, interesting. But basically, this diamond is 157 grams of diamond. Like, I'm trying to think of like what a good 150-gram item would be. What's a good illustration here? 150 grams is like hey, would it be possible to come grab me during BRB? Yeah, I can come grab you during BRB. We have about 20 minutes before that, but in 20 minutes, yeah. Uh, I see. There are like pouches of like tea or oatmeal that are about 150 grams. You know what I mean? Like a can of tea about yay big is 150 grams. So like this is a huge diamond. Like a diamond of absurd size. 150 grams is 5.3 ounces. This diamond is absurdly large. Like 5 ounces. That's so much. Oh man. Anyway, when the excitement which the appearance of this long lost treasure that had been the subject of so many romances and of such a long and fruitless search had subsided, the president continued calling the list until he had completed it. Upon taking the sum of the contributions, the great mogul was reckoned at 3 millions. It was found to still be 1,000 millions short of the required amount. The Secretary of the Treasury was instantly on his feet. Mr. President, I think we can stand that addition. Let it be added to the contribution in the United States of America. When the cheers that greeted the conclusion of the business were over, the President announced that the next affair of Congress was to select a director who should have entire charge of the preparations for the war. It was the universal sentiment that no man could be so well suited for this post as Mr. Edison himself. He was accordingly selected by unanimous and enthusiastic choice of the Great Assembly. I'll let you know in a moment, whereas. Love you too. How long a time do you require to put everything in readiness? Give me carte blanche, and I believe I can have 100 electric ships and 3,000 disintegrators ready within 6 months, replied Mr. Edison. A tremendous cheer greeted this announcement. Your powers are unlimited. Draw on the funds for as much money as you need. Whereupon the Treasury of the United States was made the dispersing officer of said fund, and the meeting adjourned. Not less than 5 million people had assembled at Washington from all parts of the world. Every one of this immense multitude had been able to listen to the speeches and the cheers in the Senate chamber, although not personally present there. Wires had been run all over the city. Oh, big yawn, Magnus. Wires had been run all over the city, and hundreds of improved telephonic receivers provided so that everyone could hear. Even those who were unable to visit Washington, people living in Baltimore, New York, Boston, and as far away as New Orleans, St. Louis, and Chicago, had also listened to the proceedings with the aid of these receivers. Upon the whole, probably not less than 50 million people had heard the deliberations of the great Congress of Nations. The excitement in Washington, by telegraph and by cable, had sent the news across the oceans to all the capitals of the earth. The exultation was so great that people seemed mad with joy. The promised exhibition of the electrical ship took place the next day. Enormous multitudes witnessed the experiment. There was a struggle for places in the car. Even Queen Victoria, accompanied by the Prince of Wales, ventured to take a ride in it, and they enjoyed it so much that Mr. Edison prolonged the journey as far as Boston and the Bunker Hill Monument. Most of the other monarchs also took a high ride, but when the turn of the Emperor of China came, he repeated a fable which he had said had come down from the time of Confucius, it being a Chinese legend. Once upon a time there was a Chinaman living in the valley of the Huangho River, who was accustomed frequently to lie on his back, gazing at and envying the birds that he saw flying away in the sky. One day he saw a black speck which rapidly grew larger and larger. Until it got near, he perceived that it was an enormous bird which overshadowed the earth with its wings. It was the elephant of birds, the roc. Excuse me. This one requested attention, and he's like, no, not like this. Magnus, yeah. You pecked my arm, man. You wanted attention. He's like, I did not want attention like this. I just wanted you to reach out and pet me. Yeah, I know. Dad mean. Uh, Come with me, said the roc, and I will show you the wonders of the kingdom of birds. The man caught hold of its claw and nestled among its feathers, and they rapidly rose high in the air and sailed away to the Kenlun Mountains. Here, as they passed near the top of the peaks, another roc made its appearance. The wings of the two great birds brushed together, and immediately they fell to fighting. In the midst of the melee, the man lost his hold and tumbled into the top of a tree, where his pigtail caught on a branch, and he remained suspended. There the unfortunate man hung helpless, until a rat, which had its home in the rocks at the foot of the tree, took compassion upon him, and climbing up, gnawed off the branch. As the man slowly and painfully wended his weary way homeward, he said, This teaches me that creatures to whom nature has given neither feathers nor wings should leave the kingdom of the birds to those who are fitted to inhabit it. Having told this story, Tsai turned his back on the electrical ship. But there was a grand ball after the exhibition was finished, and amid the outburst of enthusiasm that followed, it was suggested that a proper way to wind up the Congress and give suitable expression to the festive mood which now possessed mankind would be to have a great ball. This suggestion was met with immediate and universal approval. But for so gigantic an affair, it was, of course, necessary to make special preparations. A convenient place was selected on the Virginia side of the Potomac. A space of 10 acres was carefully leveled and covered with a polished floor. Rows of columns 100 feet apart were run across it in every direction, and these were decorated with electric lights displaying every color of the spectrum. There were unsurpassed fireworks. After this immense space, rising in the center to a height of more than 1,000 feet, was anchored a vast number of balloons, all aglow with lights and forming a tremendous dome, in which brilliant lamps were arranged in such a manner as to exhibit, in an endless succession of combinations, all the national colors, ensigns, and insignia of the various countries represented in the Congress. Blazing eagles, lions, unicorns, dragons, other imaginary creatures besides that the different nations had chosen for their symbols, appeared to hover high above the dancers, shedding a brilliant light upon the scene. Circles of magnificent thrones were placed upon the floor in convenient locations for seeing. 1,000 bands of music played, and tens of thousands of couples, gaily dressed and flashing with gems, whirled together upon the polished floor. Queen Victoria, the Queen of England, led the dance on the arm of the President of the United States. The Prince of Wales led forth the fair daughter of the President, universally admired as the most beautiful woman upon the great ballroom floor. The Emperor William, in his military dress, danced with the beauteous Princess Masakau, the daughter of the Mikado, who wore for the occasion the ancient costume of the women of her country, sparkling with jewels, glowing with quaint combinations of color, like a gorgeous butterfly. The Chinese emperor, with his pigtail flying high as he spun, danced with the Empress of Russia. The King of Siam essayed a waltz with the Queen Ranavalona of Madagascar, while the Sultan of Turkey basked in the smiles of a Chicago heiress to 100 millions. The Tsar chose for his partner a dark-eyed beauty from Peru, but King Malietola of Samoa was suspicious of all these civilized charmers, and avoiding all their allurements, expressed his joy and gave vent to his enthusiasm in a pasu. In this he was quickly joined by a band of Sioux Indian chiefs whose whoops and yells so startled the leader of a German band out in their part of the floor that he dropped his baton and, followed by the musicians, took to his heels. This incident amused the good-natured Emperor of China more than anything else that had occurred. Oh, it just keeps going. No! Keep reading this, I'm like, oh boy, we're really landing on thick. It keeps getting worse. Making muchy noise, he said, indicating the fleeing musicians with his thumbs. All you say, muchy flayed noise. And then his round face dimpled into another laugh. I, as a modern person, have opinions on this, but I'm going to keep them all right here. The scene from the outside was even more imposing than that which greeted the eye inside the brilliantly lighted enclosure. Far away in the night, rising high among the stars, the vast dome of illuminated balloons seemed like some supernatural creation, too grand and too glorious to have been constructed by the inhabitants of the earth. All around it, and from some of the balloons themselves, rose jets and fountains of fire, ceaselessly playing and blotting out the constellations of the heavens by their splendor. The Prince of Wales gave a toast at the grand banquet that followed the dance, and the Prince of Wales proposed this toast to Mr. Edison. It gives me much pleasure to offer in the name of the nations of the old world this tribute of our admiration for and our confidence in this genius of the new world. Perhaps on such an occasion as this, when all racial differences and prejudices ought to be and are buried and forgotten, I should not recall anything that might revive them. Yet I cannot refrain from expressing my happiness in knowing that the champion who is to receive the salvation of earth has come forth from the bosom of the Anglo-Saxon race. Several of the great potentates looked grave upon hearing the Prince of Wales' words, and the Tsar and the Kaiser exchanged glances, but there was no interruption to the cheers that followed. Mr. Edison, whose modesty and dislike to display and to speech-making were well known, simply said, I think we've got the machine that can whip them, but we ought not to be wasting any time. Probably they're not dancing on Mars, but they're getting ready to make us dance. These words instantly sparked a haste to embark, and turned the current of feeling in the vast assembly. There was no longer any disposition to expend time with vain boastings, rejoicings even. Everywhere the cry now became, let us make haste, let us get ready at once. Who knows, but the Martians have already embarked. They're now on their way to destroy us. Under the impulse of this new feeling, which it must be admitted was very largely inspired by terror, the vast ballroom was quickly deserted. The lights were suddenly put out in the great dome of balloons, for someone had whispered, suppose they could see that from Mars. Would they not guess what we were about and redouble their preparations to finish us? Upon the suggestion of the President of the United States, an executive committee representing all the principal nations was appointed, and without delay a meeting of this committee was assembled at the White House. Mr. Edison was summoned before it, and asked to sketch briefly the plan upon which he proposed to work. That is, pressing thousands of men for Mars. I need not enter into the details of what was done at this meeting. Let it suffice to say that when it broke up in the small hours of the morning, it had been unanimously resolved that as many thousands of men as Mr. Edison might require should immediately be placed at his disposal. As far as possible, all the great manufacturing establishments of the country should instantly be transformed into factories where electrical ships and disintegrators could be built, and upon the suggestion of Professor Sylvanus P. Thompson, the celebrated English electrical expert, seconded by Lord Kelvin, it was resolved that all the leading men of science in the world should place their services at the disposal of Mr. Edison in any capacity in which, in his judgment, they might be useful to him. The members of this committee were disposed to congratulate one another on the good work which they had so promptly accomplished, when at the moment of their adjournment a telegraphic dispatch was handed was handed to the president from Professor George E. Hale, the director of the Great Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin. The telegram read, "Something happening on Mars." Professor Bernard, watching Mars tonight with the 40-inch telescope, saw a sudden outburst of reddish light, which we think indicates something has been shot from the planet. Spectroscopic observations of the moving light indicated it was coming earthward while visible at the rate of not less than 100 miles a second. Hardly had the excitement caused by the reading of this dispatch subsided when others of a similar import came from the Lick Observatory in California, the branch of the Harvard Observatory at Arequipa in Peru, and from the Royal Observatory at Potsdam. When the telegram from this last named place was read, the Emperor William turned to his chancellor and said, "I want to go home. If I am to die, I prefer to leave my bones among those of my imperial ancestors, not in this vulgar country where no king has ever ruled. Don't like this atmosphere. Makes me feel limp." And now, whipped on by the lash of alternate hope and fear, the earth sprang to its work of preparation. Okay, gang. We're going to call it a BRB there. I'm going to be right back. As Raz has alluded, I might be a little longer than usual with the BRB. It's usually about 15 minutes in which we stretch, get hydrated, take your necessary meds, pet your pets, that kind of thing. But this time I have to go pick her up. So I will go do that. I will be back as soon as is feasible. In the meanwhile, nobody explode. Let me cue up a little music. I have some here somewhere that would work. I just need to find it. Where is it? See, I want to play Lawrence Welk, but that will get me bopped. We already did the Mendelssohn. Where is the thing? I have a specific thing, right? I had a specific piece of music. The West High Acapella Choir. That will work just fine. So our BRB music will be provided by the West High Acapella Choir from 1971. We will be back as soon as possible to find out just what the production of all this, this and that, looks like, and how Edison's potential conquest of Mars will go. Everyone play nice. I'll be back soon enough.
so nice if one day I find someone who would take my hand and summer through life with me. Someone to cling to me, stay with me right or wrong. Someone to say to me some little song of song. Someone to take my heart and give his heart to me. Someone who's ready to give the start to me. Oh yes, that would be so nice. Should it be you and me, I can see it would be nice. Someone to cling to me. Someone to sing to me. Oh yes, that would be so Consider yourself at home. Consider yourself one of the family. We've taken to you so strong. It's clear we're going to get along. Consider yourself. Consider yourself. Part of the furniture. There isn't a lot to spare. Who cares? Whatever we got, we share. If it's your chance to be, we should see some harder days. Empty harder days, like mouse. Always a chance to be somebody to put the bill. And the drinks are on the house. Consider yourself alright. We don't want to have no fuss. For after some consideration, we can stick. Consider yourself one of us. That's how it goes. Everyone knows. They all suppose what they want to suppose. When they hear ooh, papa, 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 they all suppose what they want to suppose. Timbuktu, and back again. I risk anything for one piece everything. Yes, I do anything, anything for you. There'll never be a day so sunny, it could not happen twice. There is a man with all the money, it's cheap and half the price. Who will buy this wonderful feeling? I'm so high, I swear I can fly. Me, oh my, I don't want to lose it. So what am I to do to keep the sky so blue? There must be someone who will fly. Consider yourself ordained. We don't have no cause. For after some consideration we can stay. Consider yourself one of us.
Guess who didn't know that the rest of that recording is empty sound? It's me. I didn't know that. How did we like our little acapella group, though? I find that these weird little um, these weird little recordings, they tend to have weird little delights in them. Much like our forays into the public domain, I think uh, our forays into true, the truly strange and odd, ephemeral recordings of the past can hold some very fascinating gems for us. Oh, let us get back to the book, shall we? Give me a second, I ran up the stairs. We tried to hurry, and now I am paying the price. Okay, welcome back. Let us dive into chapter 4 of Edison's Conquest of Mars, shall we? It is not necessary for me to describe the manner in which Mr. Edison performed his tremendous task. He was as good as his word, and within 6 months from the first stroke of the hammer, 100 electrical ships, each provided with a full battery of disintegrators, were floating in the air above the harbor and the partially rebuilt city of New York. It was a wonderful scene. The polished sides of the huge floating cars sparkled in the sunlight, and as they slowly rose and fell, swung this way and that upon the tides of the air, as if held by invisible cables, their brilliant pennons streaming from their peaks waved up and down like the wings of an assemblage of gigantic hummingbirds. Oh, there's an illustration of this. That's very satisfying to look at. Not knowing whether the atmosphere of Mars would prove suitable to be breathed by the inhabitants of the Earth, Mr. Edison had made provision, by means of an abundance of glass-protected openings, to permit the inmates of the electrical ships to survey their surroundings without quitting the interior. It was possible, by properly selecting the rate of undulation, to pass the vibratory impulse from the disintegrators through the glass windows of a car without damage to the glass itself. The windows were so arranged that the disintegrators could sweep around the car on all sides, but also could be directed above or below as necessity might dictate. To overcome the destructive forces employed by the Martians, no satisfactory plan had been yet devised, because there was no means to experiment with them. The production of those forces was still the secret of our enemies. But Mr. Edison had no doubt that if we could not resist their effects, we might at least be able to avoid them by the rapidity of our motions. As he pointed out, the war machines which the Martians had employed in their invasion of Earth were really very awkward and unmanageable affairs. Mr. Edison's electrical ships, on the other hand, were marvels of speed and manageability. They could dart about, turn, reverse course, rise, fall with the quickness and ease of a fish in the water. Mr. Edison calculated that even if mysterious bolts should fall upon our ships, we could diminish their power to cause injury by our rapid evolutions. We might be deceived in our expectations, and might have overestimated our powers, but at any rate, we must take our chances and try. And so, in watching the Martians, a multitude exceeding even that which had assembled during the great Congress at Washington, now thronged New York and its neighborhood to witness the mustering and departure of the ships bound for Mars. Nothing further had been heard of the mysterious phenomenon reported from the observatories 6 months before, and which at the time was believed to indicate the departure of another expedition from Mars for the invasion of Earth. If the Martians had set out to attack us, they had evidently gone astray, or perhaps it was to some other world that they were aiming at this time. The expedition had, of course, profoundly stirred the interest of the scientific world, and representatives of every branch of science from all the civilized nations urged their claims to be placed in the ships. Mr. Edison was compelled, from a lack of room, to refuse transportation to more than 1,000 of those who, now on the plea that they might be able to bring back something of advantage to science, wished to embark for Mars and as the great Napoleon did on the model of the celebrated corps of literary and scientific men which Napoleon carried with him in his invasion of Egypt, Mr. Edison selected a company of the foremost astronomers, archaeologists, anthropologists, botanists, bacteriologists, chemists, physicists, mathematicians, mechanicians, meteorologists, and experts in mining, metallurgy, and every other branch of practical science, as well as artists and photographers. It was but reasonable to believe that in another world, and a world so much older than the Earth as Mars was, these men would be able to gather materials in comparison with which the discoveries made among the ruins of ancient empires in Egypt and Babylonia would be insignificant indeed. Actually, I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge an oddity of this book. As we've been reading, every like paragraph or two, there's been kind of like an organizational title, and I've been trying to roll them into the paragraphs as we read. But if it ever sounds especially odd right at the beginning of a paragraph, right at the beginning of what sounds like a paragraph, that's why. It's because this is really strange. I would heartily suggest going and digging in the show notes and looking at the physical text of this book, because there are like just repeatedly little sections that are labeled. I find it very strange. I'm sure there is a reason for it, but it just feels very odd, right? And it really doesn't. I did a little bit of digging as to maybe try and find out. Oh, why is it this way? Why does it have this weird organization? I'm not finding anything of particular interest. In the sense of like, oh, he wrote it this way because it was that, or that sort of thing. Uh, but I did find that Edison did not give permission for his likeness to be used in this book, by the way, nor a wide variety of the characters we've already met. They just kind of got included, and everybody just kind of shrugged. Um, what? Hang on, I'm reading Wikipedia here, and apparently, uh, some versions of this book actually delve into the details of the moon mission. Uh, huh? That's super wild. Anyway, I digress. Where was I? Oh, yeah. To conquer another world, it was such a wonderful undertaking and a strange spectacle besides. There was a feeling of uncertainty which awed the vast multitude whose eyes were upturned to the ships. The expedition was not large, considering the gigantic character of the undertaking. Each of the electrical ships carried about 20 men, together with an abundant supply of compressed provisions, compressed air, scientific apparatus, and so on. In all, there were about 2,000 men who were going to conquer, if they could, another world. But though few in numbers, they represented the flower of Earth, the culmination of the genius of the planet. The greatest leaders in science, both theoretical and practical, were there. It was the evolution of the Earth against the evolution of Mars. It was a planet in the heyday of its strength, matched against an aged and decrepit world, which, nevertheless, in consequence of its long ages of existence, had acquired an experience which made it a most dangerous foe. On both sides there was desperation. The Earth was desperate because it foresaw destruction unless it could first destroy its enemy. Mars was desperate because nature was gradually depriving it of the means of supporting life, and its teeming population was compelled to swarm like the inmates of an overcrowded hive of bees and find new homes elsewhere. In this respect, the situation on Mars, as we were well aware, resembled what had already been known upon the Earth, where the older nations, overflowing with population, had sought new lands in which to settle, and for that purpose had driven out the native inhabitants, whenever those natives had proven unable to resist. No man could foresee the issue of what we were about to undertake, but the tremendous powers which the disintegrators had exhibited, and the marvelous efficiency of the electrical ships bred almost universal confidence that we should be successful. Master minds of the world traveled in a car in which Mr. Edison traveled, and it was, of course, the flagship of the squadron, and I had the good fortune to be included among its inmates. Here, besides several leading men of science from our own country, were Lord Kelvin, Lord Raleigh, Lord Professor Rontgen, Dr. Masson, the man who first made artificial diamonds, and several others whose fame had encircled the world. Each of these men cherished hopes of wonderful discoveries along his line of investigation to be made in Mars. An elaborate system of signals had, of course, to be devised for the control of the squadron. These signals consisted of brilliant electric lights displayed at night and so controlled that by their means long sentences and directions could be easily and quickly transmitted. This formed a novel signal. This formed a novel signal system. However, the day's signals were consisted partly of brightly colored pennons and flags, which were to serve only when, shadowed by clouds and other obstructions, the full sunlight should not fall upon the ships. This could naturally only occur near the surface of the earth or of another planet. Once out of the shadow of the earth, we should have no more clouds and no more night until we arrived at Mars. In open space, the sun would be continually shining. It'd be perpetual day for us, except as by artificial means we furnished ourselves with darkness for the purpose of promoting sleep. In this region of perpetual day, then, the signals were also to be translated by flashes of light from mirrors reflecting the rays of the sun. Yet indeed this perpetual day would also, in one sense, be a perpetual night. There'd be no more blue sky for us, because without an atmosphere, the sunlight could not be diffused. Objects would be illuminated only on the side toward the sun. Anything screening off the direct rays of sunlight would produce absolute darkness behind it. There'd be no graduation of shadow. The sky would be black as ink on all sides. While it was the intention to remain as much as possible within the cars, it was yet probable that necessity would arise for occasionally quitting the interior of the electrical ships. Mr. Edison had provided for this emergency by inventing an airtight dress constructed somewhat after the manner of a diver's suit, but of much lighter material. Each ship was provided with several of these suits, by wearing which one could venture outside the car even when it was beyond the atmosphere of the earth. Ah, here's an illustration of our airtight suit. It kind of looks reminiscent of. Have you ever seen? There's pictures floating around somewhere of the moon armor made by like this era of Britain. It looks a little bit like I can't unsee that. Anyway, there was terrific cold anticipated, and so provision had been made to meet the terrific cold which we knew would be encountered the moment we passed beyond the atmosphere. Ooh, terrific is very close to terrible. I was like, oh man, do I have to drink? Which, by the way, lest you forget, we are playing the Wells drinking game, which we normally only play when we are reading H.G. Wells. Um, Drink water every time you hear the words uh, tumult, zenith, for a space, terrible, and peculiar, which are H.G. Wells's favorite words, and we've decided to extend that courtesy to Mr. Service here, who wrote, as we are finding out, an unauthorized sequel to War of the Worlds. Once again, I must stress, I would heartily suggest water here. If you if you are of age to be drinking alcohol to play this drinking game, you will wind up drinking irresponsibly usually. If the Wells books are any indication here. Anyway, uh, a provision had been made to meet the terrific cold which we knew would be encountered the moment that we'd pass beyond the atmosphere, the awful absolute zero which men had measured by anticipation but never yet experienced, by a simple system of producing within the airtight suits a temperature sufficiently elevated to counteract the effects of the frigidity without. By means of long flexible tubes, air could be continually supplied to the wearers of the suits, and by an ingenious contrivance, a store of compressed air, sufficient to last for several hours, was provided for each suit, so that in the case of necessity, the wearer could throw off the tubes connecting him with the air tanks in the car. Another object which had been kept in view in preparation of these suits was the possible exploration of an airless planet, such as the moon. The necessity of some contrivance by means of which we should be enabled to converse with one another when on the outside of cars in the open space, or when in an airless world like the moon, where there be no medium by which the waves of sound could be conveyed as they are in the atmosphere of the earth, had been foreseen by our great inventor. He had not found it difficult to contrive suitable devices for meeting said emergency. Inside the headpiece of each of the electrical suits was the mouthpiece of a telephone. This was connected with a wire which, when not in use, could conveniently be coiled upon the arm of the wearer. Near the ears, similarly connected with wires, were telephonic receivers. Acting as a sort of aerial telegraph, two persons wearing the airtight dresses wished to converse with one another. It was only necessary for them to connect themselves by the wires, and conversation could then be easily carried on. When did Marconi discover the radio? Sorry, this is absolutely a digression here, but this was first published in 1898 as a magazine serial, and then publishes a book in 1947. When did Marconi discover radio waves? Was that after this was written? Marconi radio. Marconi was credited as the inventor of radio, sharing the 1909 Nobel Prize in Physics with Brown in recognition of their contributions to the development of wireless telegraphy. Known for radio, obviously. Radio work from youth. In the early 1890s, he began working on the idea of wireless telegraphy. This was not a new idea, but he did it. He got it to work. Conducting experience in radio waves. Early detector based on the 1890 findings of Edouard Branly. In the summer of 1894, he built a storm alarm made of a battery. He built a storm detector that goes off when it picks up the radio waves generated by lightning. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Late one night in December 1894, Marconi demonstrated a radio transmitter and receiver to his mother, a setup that made a bell ring on the other side of the room by pushing a telegraphic button on a bench. So 1895 is when he was continuing to perform experiments in transmission. When did he publicly demonstrate this? 1896, right? Maybe. Sorry, I'm reading the Wikipedia article very quickly. Marconi made the first demonstration of his wireless telegraph system for the British government in July 1896. Further series of demonstrations for the British followed. By 1897, in March, Marconi had transmitted over 6 kilometers, etc., etc. Numerous additional demonstrations followed. Okay, so one would presume that Marconi's wireless telegraph was known to the public. Impressed by those demonstrations, Priest introduced Marconi's ongoing work to the general public at 2 important London lectures. At the Toynbee Hall in December 1896, and at the Royal Institution in June of 1897. So Marconi's radio was very, very new, like a year, like the news of Marconi having the capability to produce wireless telegraph signals was like a year old when this was written. So maybe that's why he's like, oh, they have to be wired, because like not a lot of people knew about it by then. Who knows? Not me. But that's my impression of the rapid skimming I just did of the Wikipedia article. So like, yeah, this was first published as a magazine serial in 1898. So it was probably written. When was it published? In like what month in this serial? Does it say? It does not. Interesting. I digress. So this guy probably didn't know about Marconi's radio telegraph experiments in a nutshell, because they were too new. I was like, why isn't he using, like, antennae? They knew about antennae by then. Well, they did, but they didn't, sort of. Anyway, I digress a great deal. They connect themselves by wires. That's where we were. Careful calculations of the precise distance of Mars from the Earth at the time when the expedition was to start had been made by a large number of experts in mathematical astronomy, but it was not Mr. Edison's intention to go directly to Mars. With the exception of the first electrical ship, which he had completed, none yet had been tried in a long voyage. It was desirable that the qualities of each of the ships should be first carefully tested, and for this reason the leader of the expedition determined that the moon should be the first port of space at which the squadron would call. It chanced that the moon was so situated at this time as to be nearly in a line between Earth and Mars, which latter was in opposition to the sun, and consequently as favorably situated as possible for the purposes of this voyage. What would be then, for 99 out of 100 ships of the squadron, a trial trip, at the same time be a step of 250,000 miles gained in the direction of our journey, and so no time would be wasted. The departure from the earth was arranged to occur precisely at midnight. The moon near the full was hanging high overhead, and a marvelous spectacle was presented to the eyes of those below as the great Walium. No, the moon near the full was hanging high overhead, and a marvelous spectacle was presented to the eyes of those below as the great squadron of floating ships, with their signal lights ablaze, cast loose and began slowly to move away on their adventurous and unprecedented expedition into the great unknown. A tremendous cheer billowing up from the throats of millions of excited men and women seemed to rend the curtain of the night and made the airships tremble with the atmospheric vibrations that were set in motion. Instantly, magnificent fireworks were displayed in honor of our departure. Rockets by hundreds of thousands shot heavenward, then burst in constellations of fiery drops. The sudden illumination thus produced, overspreading hundreds of square miles of the surface of the earth with a light almost like that of day, must certainly have been visible to the inhabitants of Mars if they were watching at the time. They might or might not correctly interpret its significance, but at any rate, we didn't care. We were off, and we were confident that we would meet our enemy on his own ground before he could attack us again. And now, as we slowly rose higher, a marvelous scene was disclosed, the earth wrapped in space like a globe. At first, of course, the earth beneath us, buried as it was in night, resembled the hollow of a vast cup of ebony blackness, in the center of which, like the molten lava run together at the bottom of a volcanic crater, shone the light of illuminations around New York. But when we got beyond the atmosphere, and the earth still continued to recede below us, its aspect changed. The cup-shaped appearance was gone, and it began to round out beneath our eyes in the form of a vast globe, an enormous ball mysteriously suspended under us, glimmering over most its surface, with the faint illumination of the moon, and showing toward its eastern edge the oncoming light of the rising sun. When we were still further away, having slightly varied our course so that the sun was once more entirely hidden behind the center of the earth, we saw its atmosphere completely illuminated all around it with prismatic lights like a gigantic rainbow in the form of a ring. Another shift in our course rapidly carried us out of the shadow of the earth and into the all-pervading sunshine. Then the great planet beneath us hung unspeakable in its beauty. The outlines of several of the continents were clearly discernible on its surface, streaked and spotted with delicate shades of varying color, and the sunlight flashed and glowed in long lanes along the convex surface of the oceans. Parallel with the equator, along the regions of the ever-blowing trade winds, were vast belts of clouds, gorgeous with crimson and purple as the sunlight fell upon them. Immense expanses of snow and ice lay like a glittering garment upon both land and sea around the North Pole. As we gazed upon this magnificent spectacle, bidding farewell to this terrestrial sphere, our hearts bounded within us. This was our Earth. This was the planet we were going to defend, our home in the trackless wilderness of space. And it seemed to us, indeed, a home for which we might gladly expend our last breath. A new determination to conquer or die sprang up in our hearts, and I saw Lord Kelvin, after gazing at the beauteous scene which the earth presented through his eyeglass, turn about and peer in the direction in which we knew that Mars lay, with a sudden frown that caused the glass to lose its grip and fall dangling from the string upon his chest. Well, even Mr. Edison seemed moved. "I'm glad I thought of the disintegrator. I shouldn't like to see that world down there laid waste again." "And it won't be," said Professor Sylvanus P. Thompson, gripping the handle of an electric machine. "Not if we can help it." Chapter 5. One moment. Yes. I am actively using it. No, I might be able to use the space bar to advance the page. Mm. Can I borrow that one? I don't need the scroll wheel. Raz is experiencing technical difficulties off stream. Bless her. She's doing so well soaking up the technical difficulties so I don't explode. Everyone say thank you, Raz. Isn't she a delight? Yeah, I don't. Did you just fix it? I can see what you mean.
There you go.
Okay.
Hello, Internet. I'm so sorry.
Be patient, everyone. I need to unplug my mouse. Oh, no, I don't need to get up for that because it's plugged in right here.
Just right here.
Doot.
I panicked because I was like, oh god, nowhere that's gonna sell computer devices open this late.
I heard step, 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 and I was like, oh.
You could tell they were panic steppers.
Mhm.
I was like,
Luckily, it was we were at a chapter boundary, so you caught us at the right time.
I was like, oh god, oh jeez.
Oh jeez, I'm gonna have to interrupt him.
I was like,
You interrupted at like the perfect time, so
once again, I'm really good at timing.
yeah, as usual. That was not sarcastic, by the way. She is usually very well timed. Oh, thank you for your patience, everyone. Thankfully, I have managed to dodge the scuff pretty broadly these days. Anyway, chapter 5. Oh, this mouse is terrible. But I digress. Chapter 5. To prevent accidents, it had been arranged that the ships should keep a considerable distance apart. Some of them gradually drifted away until, on account of the neutral tint of their sides, they were swallowed up in the abyss of space. Still, it was possible to know where every signal of every member of the squadron was through the constant interchange of signals. These, as I have explained previously, were effected by means of mirrors flashing back the light of the sun. But although it was now unceasing day for us, yet there being no atmosphere to diffuse the sun's light, the stars were visible to us just as night upon the earth, and they shone with extraordinary splendor against the intense black background of the firmament. The lights of some of the more distant ships in our squadron were not brighter than the stars in whose neighborhood they seemed to be. In some cases, it was only possible to distinguish between the light of a ship and that of a star by the fact that the former was continually flashing, while the star was steady in its radiance. This produced a most uncanny effect by the absence of atmosphere. This revealed a most uncanny effect produced by the absence of atmosphere around us. Inside the car, where there was air, the sunlight streaming through one or more windows was diffused and produced ordinary daylight. But when we ventured outside, we could only see things by halves. The side of the car that the sun's rays touched was visible, the other side invisible, the light from the stars not making it bright enough to affect the eye in contrast with the sun-illumined half. As I held up my arm before my eyes, half of it seemed to be shaved off lengthwise. A companion on the deck of the ship looked like half a man, so the other electrical ships near us appeared as half ships, only the illuminated sides being visible. Oh, there's a fantastic illustration of this, where, like, the light lines are stark and, like, the unlit sides just disappear into the blackness. I do wonder how, like, accurate that is, because obviously, like, there's not a lot of refraction of light in space. It just kind of moves in straight lines unaffected by the bend of air. So, like, is the lighting that harsh in actual space situations? I might have to look up some NASA footage for that, see if there's some kind of, if there's some spacewalk footage and check back on that. Anyway, we'd now got so far away that the Earth had taken on the appearance of a heavenly body, like the moon. Its colors had become all blended into a golden reddish hue, which overspread nearly its entire surface, except at the poles, where there were broad patches of white. It was marvelous to look at this huge orb behind us, while far beyond it shone the blazing sun like an enormous star in the blackest of nights. In the opposite direction appeared the silver orb of the moon, and scattered all around were millions of brilliant stars, amid which, like fireflies, splashed and sparkled the signal lights of the squadron. A danger manifested itself, a danger that might have easily been anticipated, perhaps, but against which it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to provide pleasant. Uh, oh, provide, like, it just says to provide, like, a danger that might have easily been anticipated, that perhaps had been anticipated, but against which it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to provide, presently manifested itself. Do they mean as in provide defense? De- I'm going to assume provide defense. Anyway, looking out of a window toward the right, I suddenly noticed the lights of a distant ship darting about in a curious curve. Instantly afterward, another member of the squadron, nearby, behaved in the same inexplicable manner. Then 2 or 3 of the floating cars seemed to be violently drawn from their courses and hurried rapidly in the direction of the flagship. Immediately, I perceived a small object, luridly flaming, which seemed to move with immense speed in our direction. The truth instantly flashed upon my mind, and I shouted to the other occupants of the car, "A meteor!" And such indeed it was. We had met this mysterious wanderer in space at a moment when we were moving in a direction at right angles to the path it was pursuing around the sun. Small as it was, and its diameter probably did not exceed a single foot, it was yet an independent little world, and as such, a member of the solar system. I knew that its velocity, assuming to be traveling in a nearly circular orbit, must be about 18 miles a second. With this velocity, then, it plunged like a projectile shot by some mysterious enemy in space directly through our squadron. It had come and was gone before one could utter a sentence of 3 words. Its appearance, and the effect it had produced upon the ships in whose neighborhood it passed, indicated that it bore an intense and tremendous charge of electricity. How it had become thus charged, I cannot pretend to say. I simply record the fact. And this charge, it was evident, was opposite in polarity to that which the ships of the squadron bore. It therefore exerted an attractive influence upon them, and thus drew them after it. I just had time to think how lucky it was that the meteor didn't strike any of us, when, glancing at just a ship ahead, I perceived that an accident had occurred. The ship swayed violently from its course, dazzling flashes playing around it, and 2 or 3 of the men forming its crew appeared for an instant on its exterior, wildly gesticulating, but almost instantly falling prone. It was evident at a glance that the car had been struck by the meteor. How serious the damage might be, we couldn't instantly determine. The course of our ship was immediately altered, the electric polarity was changed, and we rapidly approached the disabled car. The men who had fallen lay upon its surface. One of the heavy circular glasses covering a window had been smashed to atoms. Through this the meteor had passed, killing 2 or 3 men who stood in its course. Then it had crashed through the opposite side of the car, and, passing on, disappeared into space. The store of air contained in the car had immediately rushed out through the openings, and when 2 or 3 of us, having donned our airtight suits as quickly as possible, entered the wrecked car, we found all its inmates stretched upon the floor in a condition of asphyxiation. They, as well as those who lay upon the exterior, were immediately removed to the flagship. Restoratives were supplied, and fortunately our aid had come so promptly that the lives of all of them were saved, but Life had fled from the mangled bodies of those who stood directly in the path of the fearful projectile. If you think about it, like, I guess they would have some kind of reference for that aggressive decompression, if you think about it, like, because they've experimented with, submarines and, like, pressure vessels and, like, keeping people in diving bells and the like, and so very suddenly being out of air, uh, you know, is technically recoverable, even if it's complete vacuum, as in space. You have a minute or two that you could get people to recover with, eh, by modern reckoning, anyway. So could be. I'm trying to suspend my disbelief in regards to general science reactions to this, but that one I'm like, oh yeah, that tracks. I don't know much about decompressing in a spaceship, but that tracks. There's an illustration of the meteor passing through the spaceship and striking down several people. It's very evocative. This strange incident had been witnessed by several of the members of the fleet, and they quickly drew together in order to inquire for the particulars. As the flagship was now overcrowded by the addition of so many men to its crew, Mr. Edison had them distributed among the other cars. Fortunately, it happened that the disintegrators contained in the wrecked car were not injured. Mr. Edison thought that it would be possible to repair the car itself, and for that purpose he had it attached to the flagship in order that it might be carried on as far as the moon. The bodies of the dead were carried on with it, as it was determined, instead of committing them to the fearful deep of space, where they would have wandered forever, or else have fallen like meteors upon the earth, to instead give them interment in the lunar soil. As we now rapidly approached the moon, the change which the appearance of its surface underwent was no less wonderful than that which the surface of the earth had presented in the reverse order, while we were receding from it. From a pale silver orb shining with comparative faintness among the stars, it slowly assumed the appearance of a vast mountainous desert. As we drew nearer, its colors became more pronounced. The great flat regions appeared darker, the mountain peaks shone more brilliantly. The huge chasms seemed bottomless and blacker than midnight. Gradually, separate mountains appeared, what seemed like expanses of snow, and immense glaciers streaming down their sides sparkled with great brilliancy in the perpendicular rays of the sun. Our motion had now assumed an aspect of falling. We seemed to be dropping from an immeasurable height, and with an inconceivable velocity, straight down upon those giant peaks. Here and there, curious lights glowed down upon the mysterious surface of the moon. Where the edge of the moon cut the sky behind it, it was broken and jagged with the mountain masses of Luna. Vast crater rings overspread its surface, and in some of these I imagined I could perceive a lurid illumination coming out of their deepest cavities, and the curling of mephitic vapors around their terrible jaws. We were approaching that part of the moon which is known to astronomers as the Bay of Rainbows. Here a huge semicircular region, as smooth almost as the surface of a prairie, lay beneath our eyes, stretching southward into a vast ocean-like expanse, while on the north it was enclosed by an enormous range of mountain cliffs, rising perpendicularly to a height of many thousands of feet, rent and gashed in every direction by forces which seemed at some remote period to have labored in tearing this little world to pieces. A dead and mangled world, the moon's strange and ghastly surface, in full view of man, it was truly a fearful spectacle, too dreadful to look upon. The idea of the death of the moon was, of course, not a new one to many of us. We'd long been aware that the Earth's satellite was a body which passed beyond the stage of life, if indeed it ever had been a life-supporting globe, but none of us were prepared for the terrible spectacle which now smote our eyes. At the end of each semicircular ridge that encloses the Bay of Rainbows, there's a lofty promontory. That, at the northwestern extremity, had long been known to astronomers under the name of Cape Laplance. The other promontory, at the southeastern termination, is called Cape Heraclides. It was toward the latter that we were approaching, and by interchange of signals, all the members of the squadron had been informed that Cape Heraclides was to be our rendezvous upon the moon. I must say that I had been somewhat unfamiliar with the scenery of this part of the lunar world, for I'd often studied it from the earth with a telescope, and I had thought if there was any part of the moon where one might, with fair expectation of success, look for inhabitants, or if not for inhabitants, at least relics of life no longer existent, that this would surely be the place. It was, therefore, with no small degree of curiosity, notwithstanding the unexpectedly frightful and repulsive appearance the surface of the moon presented, that I now saw myself rapidly approaching the region concerning whose secrets my imagination had so often busied itself. When Mr. Edison and I had paid our previous visit to the moon on the first experimental trip of the electrical ship, we'd landed at a point on its surface remote from this, and as I've before explained, made no effort to investigate its secrets. But now it was to be different, and we were, at length, to see something of the wonders of the moon. I had often on the earth drawn a smile from my friends by showing them Cape Heraclides with a telescope, and calling their attention to the fact that the outline of the peak terminating the cape was as to present a remarkable resemblance to a human face, unmistakably a feminine countenance seen in profile, possessing no small degree of beauty. To my astonishment, this curious human semblance still remained, when we had approached so close to the moon that the mountains forming the cape filled nearly the whole field of view from the window from which I was watching it. The resemblance, indeed, was most startling. "Can this indeed be Diana herself?" I said, half aloud, but instantly afterward I was laughing at my fancy, for Mr. Edison had overheard me and exclaimed, Where is she? Where is she?" "Who?" "Diana." "Why, there," I said, pointing to the moon, but lo! the appearance was gone even while I spoke, the resemblance disappearing. A swift change had taken place in the line of sight by which we were viewing it, and the likeness had disappeared in consequence. A few moments later my astonishment was revived, but the cause this time was a very different one. We'd been dropping rapidly toward the mountains, and the electrician in charge of the car was swiftly and constantly changing his potential, and, like a pilot who feels his way into an unknown harbor, endeavoring to approach the moon in such a manner that no hidden perils could surprise us. As we thus approached, I suddenly perceived, crowning the very apex of the lofty peak, near the termination of the cape, the ruins of what appeared to be an ancient watchtower. It was evidently composed of cyclopean blocks, larger than any I had ever seen among the ruins of Greece, Egypt, and even Asia Minor. Ah, and so we have a little illustration of this cyclopean watchtower. Fascinating. Here, then, was visible proof that the moon had been inhabited, although probably it was not inhabited now. I cannot describe the exultant feeling which took possession of me at this discovery, settled so much that learned men had been disputing about for centuries. "What will they say when I show them a photograph of that?" I exclaimed. Below the peak, stretching far to the right and left, lay a barren beach which evidently had been once washed by sea waves. It was marked by long curved ridges, such as the advancing and retiring tide leaves upon the shore of the ocean. The beach sloped rapidly outward and downward toward a profound abyss, which had once evidently been the bed of a sea, but now appeared to us simply as the empty, yawning shell of an ocean that had long since vanished. It was with no small difficulty, and only after the expenditure of considerable time, that all the floating ships of the squadron were gradually brought to rest on this lone mountain on top of the moon. In accordance with my request, Mr. Edison had the flagship moored in the interior of the great ruined watchtower I have described. The other ships rested upon the slope of the mountain around us. Although time pressed upon us, we knew that the safety of the earth depended on our promptness in attacking Mars, yet we determined to remain here at least 2 or 3 days in order that the wrecked car might be repaired. It was found also that the passage of the highly electrified meteor had disarranged the electrical machinery in some of the other cars, so that there were many repairs to be made beside those needed to restore the wreck. Moreover, we must bury our unfortunate Moreover, we must bury our unfortunate companions who had been killed by the meteor. This, in fact, was our first work that we performed. Strange was the sight, and stranger our feelings, as here on the surface of a world distant from the earth, and on soil which had never before been pressed by the foot of man, we performed that last ceremony of respect which mortals pay to mortality. In the ancient beach, at the foot of the peak, we made a deep opening, and there covered forever the faces of our friends, leaving them to sleep among the ruins of empires and among the graves of races which had vanished, probably ages before Adam and Eve appeared in paradise. While the repairs were being made, several scientific expeditions were sent out in various directions across the moon. One went westward to investigate the great ring plain of Plato and the lunar Alps. Another crossed the ancient Sea of Showers toward the lunar Apennines. One started to explore the immense crater of Copernicus, which, yawning 50 miles across, presents a wonderful appearance even from the distance of the earth. The ship in which I myself had the good fortune to embark was bound for the mysterious lunar mountain Aristarchus. Before these expeditions started, a careful exploration had been made in the neighborhood of Cape Heraclides. But, except that the broken walls of the watchtower on the peak, composed of blocks of enormous size, had evidently been the work of creatures endowed with, at minimum, human intelligence, no remains were found indicating the former presence of inhabitants upon this part of the moon. But, along the shore of the old sea, just where the so-called Bay of Rainbows separates itself from the abyss of the Sea of Showers, there were found some stratified rocks in which the fascinated eyes of these explorers beheld the clear imprint of a gigantic human foot measuring 5 feet in length, from toe to heel. And now we have an illustration of the fascinated eyes of these explorers, beholding a big footprint. The most minute search failed to reveal another trace of the presence of this ancient giant, who had left the impress of his foot in the wet sands of the beach here so many million years ago that even the imagination of the geologist shrank from the task of attempting to fix the precise period of this great footprint. Around the gigantic footprint gathered most of the scientific members of the expedition, wearing their oddly shaped airtight suits, connected with telephonic wires, and the spectacle, but for the impressiveness of the discovery, would have been laughable and in the extreme. Bending over a mark in the rock, nodding their heads together, pointing with their awkwardly accoutred arms, they looked like an assemblage of antediluvian monsters collected around their prey. The disappointment over the fact that no marks of anything resembling human habitation could be discovered, well, that was very great. Still, the footprint in itself was quite sufficient, as they all declared, to settle the question of the former inhabitation of the moon. It would serve for the production of many a learned volume after their return to the earth, even if no further discoveries should be made in other parts of the lunar world. It was the hope of making such other discoveries that led to the dispatch of various other expeditions that had been previously named over the moon. I had chosen to accompany the car that was going to Aristarchus because, as everyone who had viewed the moon from Earth was aware, there was something very mysterious about that mountain. I knew that it was a crater nearly 30 miles in diameter and very deep, although its floor was plainly visible. What rendered it remarkable was the fact that the floor and the walls of the crater besides, particularly on the inner side, glowed with a marvelous brightness which rendered them almost blinding when viewed with a powerful telescope. So bright they were, indeed, that the eye was unable to see many of the details which the telescope would have made visible but for the flood of light which poured from the mountains. Sir William Herschel had been so completely misled by this appearance, he supposed he was watching a lunar volcano in eruption. It had always been a difficult question what caused the extraordinary luminosity of Aristarchus. No end of hypotheses had been invented to account for it. Now I was to assist in settling these questions forever. From Cape Heraclides to Aristarchus, The distance in an airline was something over 300 miles. Our course lay across the northeastern part of the Sea of Showers, with enormous cliffs, mountain masses, and peaks shining on the right, while in the other direction the view was bounded by the distant range of the lunar Apennines, some of whose towering peaks, when viewed from our immense elevation, appeared as sharp as the Swiss Matterhorn. When we had arrived about 100 miles When we had arrived within about 100 miles of our destination, we found ourselves floating directly over the so-called Harbinger Mountains. The serrated peaks of Aristarchus then appeared ahead of us, fairly blazing in the sunshine. It seemed as if a gigantic string of diamonds, every one as great as a mountain peak, had been cast down upon the barren surface of the moon and left to waste their brilliance upon the desert air of this abandoned world. Ooh, we have an illustration of that gigantic string of diamonds illuminating the desert air. As we rapidly approached, the dazzling splendor of the mountain became almost unbearable to our eyes, and we were compelled to resort to the device practiced by all climbers of lofty mountains, where the glare of sunlight upon snow surfaces is liable to cause temporary blindness, and so we protected our eyes with neutrally tinted glasses. Professor Moissan, the great French chemist and maker of artificial diamonds, fairly danced with delight. Voila, 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 was all that he could say. Is Professor Moissan why there is a mineral called moissanite? Sorry, I'm very easily distractible with Googleable facts tonight. Moissanite. Moissanite is a naturally occurring silicon carbide discovered by the French chemist Henri Moissan in 1893. So a different Moissan is why we know about moissanite. Or is that the same Moissan? I mean, unclear. Hang on, click here. French chemist and pharmacist who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1906 for isolating fluorine from its compounds. Originally a trainee in pharmacy, became a chemist. First served baccalaureate. He succeeded. Isolation of fluorine. Contributed to the development of the electric arc furnace, and attempted to use pressure to produce synthetic diamonds. Also used the furnace to synthesize borates and carbides of very numerous elements. Calcium carbide was a notable accomplishment. Considered studying fragments of a meteorite and meteor crater in Arizona. Extensive research, Moissan concluded that this silicon carbide existed, and that's why it's called moissanite. So did he generate artificial diamonds with this arc furnace? That's definitely who's being talked about here. So it's definitely like why moissanite is called moissanite. But like all applications of silicon carbide today use synthetic material. The natural material is apparently very scarce and generally only found in meteorites. Fascinating. Well, that's reading for future Michael. As it were. Where was I? This guy, yeah, arc furnace. That's who we were. Yeah. When we were comparatively near, the mountain no longer seemed to glow with a uniform radiance evenly distributed over its entire surface, but now innumerable points of light, all so bright as many little suns, blazed away at us. It was evident that we had before us a mountain composed of, or at least covered with, crystals. Without stopping to alight on the outer slopes of the great ring-shaped range of peaks which composed Aristarchus, we sailed over their rim and looked down into the interior. Here the splendor of the crystals was greater than on the outer slopes, and the broad floor of the crater, thousands of feet beneath us, shone and sparkled with an overwhelming radiance, as if it were an immense bin of diamonds, while the peak in the center flamed like a stupendous tiara encrusted with selected gems. Eager to see what these crystals were, the car was now allowed rapidly to drop into the interior of the crater. With great caution, we brought it to rest upon the blazing ground, for the sharp edges of the crystal would certainly have torn the metallic sides of the car if it had come into violent contact with them. Donning our airtight stu- Donning our airtight suits and stepping carefully out upon this wonderful footing, we attempted to detach some of the crystals. Many of them were firmly fastened, but a few, some of astonishing size, were readily loosened. A moment's inspection showed that we'd stumbled upon the most marvelous work of the forces of crystallization that human eyes had ever rested upon. Indeed, we had stumbled upon a wealth of gems. Sometime in the past history of the moon, there had been an enormous outflow of molten material from the crater. This had overspread the walls and partially filled up the interior, and later its surface had flowered into gems as thick as blossoms in a bed of pansies. The whole mass flashed prismatic rays of indescribable beauty and intensity. We gazed at first, speechless with amazement. It surely cannot be, said Professor Masson at length. But it is, another member of the party said. Are these diamonds? I cannot yet tell, replied the professor. They have the brilliancy of diamonds, but they may be something else. Moon jewels, suggested a third. And worth untold millions, whatever they are, remarked another. These magnificent moon jewels, jewels from the moon, some of which appeared to be almost flawless, varied in size from the dimensions of a hazelnut to geometric solids several inches in diameter. We carefully selected as many as it was convenient to carry, and placed them in the car for future examination. We had solved another long-standing lunar problem, and had, perhaps, opened up an inexhaustible mine of wealth which might eventually go far toward reimbursing the Earth for the damage which it suffered from the invasion of the Martians. On returning to Cape Heraclides, we found that the other expeditions had arrived at the rendezvous ahead of us. Their members had wonderful stories to tell of what they'd seen, but nothing caused quite so much astonishment as that which we had to tell and to show. The party which had gone to visit Plato in the lunar Alps brought back, however, information which, in a scientific sense, was no less interesting than what we'd been able to gather. They had found within this curious ring of Plato, which is a circle of mountains 60 miles in diameter, enclosing a level plain remarkably smooth over most of its surface, unmistakable evidences of former inhabitation. A gigantic city had evidently at one time existed near the center of this great plain. The outlines of its walls and the foundation marks of some of its immense buildings were plainly made out, and elaborate plans of this vanished capital of the moon were prepared by several members of the party. One of them was fortunate enough to discover an even more precious relic of the ancient Lunarians, more evidences of habitation, as it were. It was a piece of petrified skull bone representing but a small portion of the head to which it belonged, but yet sufficient to enable the anthropologists, who immediately fell to examining it, to draw ideal representations of the head, as it must have been in life. The head of a giant of enormous size, which, if it had possessed a highly organized brain of proportionate magnitude, must have given to its possessor intellectual powers immensely greater than any of the descendants of Adam had ever been endowed with. Indeed, one of the professors was certain that some little concretions found on the interior piece of the skull were petrified portions of the brain matter itself, and he set to work with the microscope to examine its organic quality. In the meantime, however, the repairs to the electrical ships had been completed, and although these discoveries upon the moon had created a most profound sensation among the members of the expedition, and aroused an almost irresistible desire to continue said explorations that we had thus happily begun, everybody yet knew that these things were aside from the main purpose in our view, and that we should be false to our duty in wasting a moment more upon the moon than was absolutely necessary to put the ships in proper condition to proceed on their warlike voyage. And so, everything being prepared then, we departed the moon with great regret, just 48 hours after we'd landed upon its surface, carrying with us a determination to revisit it and learn more of its wonderful secrets, in case we should survive the dangers which we were now going to face. Alright, folks. Mm. I am a bit tireder than usual, and so I think I'm going to call it an evening there. I have things to promote, things variously, with various authors and various attributors. First of all, we have my Discord, where you can come talk about paper cuts. You can come talk about the other streams that occasionally happen around here. You can come check out early pictures of the loaves of bread I'm baking, exclusive in progress pictures of my embroidery, many weeks in advance of when you might be able to see it elsewhere, say on my Tumblr. Um, Generally keeping up with my hobbies. You can sit in the voice channels while we edit the podcast, or come along with me while I dig through my increasingly growing collection of analog media to digitize and categorize. That sort of thing. I try to make it very entertaining in there, and my Discord gets some unique content that nowhere gets that either nowhere else on the internet gets or someplace else on the internet gets at a great delay, variously. That logo above my head is for the Codex. That is a group of reading streamers. It's the Twitch team I'm on. They're all very good people, and if you like what I do here during paper cuts, you will like them. We kind of run the gamut in regards to genre. And so if you like what I do, but you're like, this man reads way too much science fiction for his own good, please read something else. Uh, First of all, come say that in the Discord, in the Paper Cuts channel, and suggest some things that you think I should read. But second of all, if you don't want to do that, go check out the Codex. It is not only a Discord of fellow readers, but also my Twitch team, which should be accessible below me. What else? For the live listener, this is a podcast named Paper Cuts, as one would expect. You can find it in your favorite podcatcher or at papercutsbooks.libsyn.com. That's papercutsbooks.libsyn.com. The default design for the Libsyn website is workable but bad. Like, I want to stress, it is visually uninteresting. You can navigate it. It is usable. I don't like the look of it. I'm also a snob because I'm a web developer. I'm trying to find out if I can fix it. For the podcast listener, however, check the show notes. We record this show live Friday nights, 8 p.m. Pacific is the current time slot, but it has always been Friday nights. It's just a question of what the time slot is. Keep one eye on the Discord for that kind of thing. I will continue to announce the streams a little ways in advance. I'll even be able to send timestamps that update based on your time zone, so you don't have to do the math anymore. That's nice. If you would prefer a vodcast rather than a podcast, a video version of the podcast is available on my YouTube under the name Glacier Nestor. Occasionally, I post other things over there, like shorts cut from the stream VODs, or other things that I'm making. I might stop resisting the urge to make synth music, for example. So keep an eye on that if you want to have more of what we do here. I'd heartily recommend it. Um, I think that's everything I have to promote. Technically, I have a TikTok. It is under the name Glacier Nestor. Um, it doesn't have any paper cuts content yet. I'm working on that. I have some scripts written that I need to film and voice over and edit. Uh, I'll get there. I'll get there. Anyway, all my plugs over and done with. Uh, I think we should call it there. And so this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.